world is left with whatever is not a part of this tradition, which is not a part of Western liberalism. Rather than claiming that, the reaction tends to be, it's highly dialectical, is to say, of course, we are very different, but jolly good for that. Or Asian values began that, saying, of course, we don't believe in liberty and we don't believe in toleration, but that's right, we believe in discipline, said the Asian value enthusiast from East Asia. And from West Asia comes, and South Asia too sometimes, comes this answer now that, okay, that it's, you may have Western value, but that's not the way we think. We think in terms of obedience and tradition, following holy books and of different religions, and holy instruction based on that. But that's not really the tradition. That's not the way the division have actually worked. And I think it's a subject on which there is a need to think, rethink. Again, in terms of globalization, if you place yourself, say, not at the end of the millennium, as we have just passed, but the beginning of the millennium, 1000 AD, you will find a world in which what now goes by the name of Western science is flourishing primarily in a country called China. That is, this is a world in which 1000 AD, paper and printing exists, crossbow and gunpowder exists, the clock exists, and so does the iron chain suspension bridge, the kite, the magnetic compass, the wheelbarrow, the rotary fan, each one of them known exclusively in China and virtually nowhere else. It's globalization which will get it across the world. And similarly, if you look at math, the decimal system emerged in India shortly after 2nd century AD, it moved to the Arab world by the 8th, moved to Europe by about the 11th century, had a profound impact, along with Arab mathematics and Indian mathematics and others, of a variety of kind, of which we still have these verbal evidences left in things like algorithm, algebra, and a lot of other terminology. So the question has to be asked, what is it that people from the Western world and the non-Western world have to, with what can they distinguish themselves? Has the distinction to be that non-Western people, pushed by Western chauvinism and pulled by fundamentalism of a non-Western chauvinist kind, should it have to be theological thing rather than science, culture, literature, mathematics, and so forth? And that's a very big question that we have to face in dealing with globalizing world. And insofar as the pro-globalization people don't take an adequately broad view of globalization, I would say that they are making a similar mistake. They're really selling globalization short. The great deal of what we are today is a product of globalization, quite often not even occurring very close to here. I mean, let me give you one more example before I leave it. I mentioned printing, which, by the way, is actually one of the things that people recognize is very big. Thomas Carlyle, in discussing Francis Bacon, mentioned that the three ways of distinguishing civilization, he's talking mainly about Western civilization, are printing, gunpowder, and the Protestant religion. Now, the Chinese could not be blamed for the Protestant religion, but if you look at printing, it's not even that it's just globalization, in fact, it's in the sense of happening far away from here. But it's also, what is this book that is first printed in the 9th century? Is it a very insular Chinese cultural local treatise? No. It is a Chinese translation of a Sanskrit book called Vajrachedika Prajnaparamita, which I remember reading in school in Sanskrit. And it's a wonderfully interesting Buddhist text, in English often called the Diamond Sutra. It was translated by a half-Turkish, half-Indian gentleman called Kumarajiva. His father migrated from India to Turkey, married a Turkish woman, produced a child who migrated to China, who translated the Sanskrit book into Chinese 499 AD, and it was published. It was the first printed book in the 9th century. It's a marvelous history of globalization. Many countries involved. But the West is nowhere, in fact, in that story. Now, it's very important to get in my judgment, the point across, because I think the whole debate about the Western, non-Western culture and civilization, and I think has been very badly affected by lack of basic interest in history. I turn now to other issues. And obviously, we have to come to subjects like the debates that are enormously important now, namely the economic globalization, and the history of it also extends, of course, very far back. Virtually at any period you look, you would see commodities from one country in very far away from that country elsewhere. The two issues that come up immediately are these. One is the question about, is the presence of extensive trade a beneficial thing for the world, or is it not? I think the answer to that is very straightforward. It's very deeply beneficial. And any answer that one wants to give to that question at a sophisticated level has to first begin by acknowledging what is the most elementary fact. And then there's a question as to in what way it may not be. Well, it may not be in terms of the issue of inequality. Does it encourage inequality? And does that make it bad? Does it lead to asymmetry of power? Joe Nye has written, and this is the point I very much agree with him, about what he calls democratic deficit in the world. And then he asks the question what we can do about it, that in a sense, globalization taken broadly also requires a kind of spread of democracy. And so one answer to globalizing what could be globalizing democracy, just as globalizing the world economy is part of that, and globalizing the concern about equity could be one of them. All these are among the things that we might consider. Let me begin with the democracy issue. And I think there's no question in my mind that Joe and others are right to put focus very much on that. Where I think I might disagree a little bit, in focus, is what we decide to emphasize. There is a question as to just as globalization is a difficult term, democracy is a difficult term too. Democracy, of course, is not just majority vote, as you yourself point out. It's a question of plurality of voices. Where I somewhat disagree is that I think you are a little hard, like lots of people are, to NGOs. You mention self-appointed non-government organizations, and you question their right. I should declare an interest, since I'm honorary president of Oxfam. I'm very much an interested party in that, but I'm trying to be very objective at this moment. I think NGOs could be very powerful, and that could be questioned, and certainly it's unelected, self-appointed. I don't know who else could appoint us. I don't know that. But democracy is also increasing the plurality of voices. And one of the things that NGOs have often been concerned with is to precisely increase the voices. If I may talk for a second about Oxfam itself, it began, of course, on feeding people and dealing with famine, as the name indicates. Increasingly moved towards advocacy. It had a voice. I've just written the foreword to the new Oxfam book on trade, which should be out in a week or so. And it is a view about how trade could be more fair, could be made more fair. And I think that is a democratic contribution. Whether or not we are appointed by the Queen or self-appointed, we are Actually, I am appointed by the Queen as Master of Trinity, but not as the honorary President of Oxfam. But I would say that we do have something to contribute. And I'll give an example. Take the case of a country with which I'm very involved, namely my neighboring country, Pakistan. And one of the interesting things, I mean, Pakistan is going through, in my judgment, a very major change, which is not just about Musharraf and so on. I think the growth of civil society in Pakistan is quite remarkable. And it began happening before Musharraf. I think papers like Friday Times started making a difference considerably before. But now the Friday Times looks like radical and fearless. I would say that Herald, is in the same direction, perhaps even more in some ways. The Dawn is a newspaper. Whole lot of a kind of critique which was in India we were lucky to have for a long time, but in Pakistan it happened. Now, one of the things in the Musharraf context, and that question comes up, and I don't disagree with the New York Times editorial, which said that Musharraf should hold elections, a plebiscite or a referendum is not adequate. I agree with that. But yet, democracy can't be judged only in terms of this election, of course. It's also how much tolerance you have of pluralism of people being able to say. The fact that Herald could say that Musharraf is not acting in the best interests of the country and still continue to publish and not get into difficulty is the thing that is, I will say, the part of democracy. And that's very important, and some of the elected governments have been far less tolerant. My friend Najam said he, in editing the Friday Times, was put into prison, arrested in the middle of the night, with all the kind of horrors that we know with the regime, but that was a democratic regime. So a democratic in the majority rule sense. So I think one has to see the plurality issue very importantly. So it is a point of focus. I think you're rather harder on the NGOs, and especially since many countries in the world have military governments today, quite often NGOs have been able to play the role of giving voice to people who would not have otherwise got that voice. So I would mention that. And in the context of democracy, I would also say that there is a little bit of a danger. You see, you say here, moreover, unlike, you didn't know that's what I'm going to do, did you? Unlike self-appointed non-government organization, NGOs, you explain in bracket, international institutions tend to be highly responsive to national governments and can thus claim some real, if indirect, democratic legitimacy. I accept that. But you see, there's the underside of that too. Take United Nations, which has exactly that feature. It has all those things run by the government. But the way the power structure of the world proceeds now, and even within the United Nations, it's very difficult for it to address certain issues which a kind of, I would have thought, the cause of global democracy would have wanted. Just to give an example, one of the ways in which the world was made terrible in the past, of course, was the conversion of African potentially democratic governments, and sometimes actually democratic government, into military ruled by support from either the United States and the NATO countries or by the Soviet Union. As long as there was a military coup in their direction, they would accept it. And so dictators were never without any absence of friend. Now today that's changed, but I think in some ways the extension of that is the extent to which the dominant countries in the world plays a part in the dreadful trade of armament, which goes out in a dramatic way in the world. And when Kofi Annan made a very minor proposal of having an agreement on small arms, illegal export of small arms. So two qualifications: small, not large; illegal, not legal export of small arms. Most of the people in the world, by the way, are killed by small arms. The United States refused to sign it. But looking at the United Nations, it's done almost nothing about the arms trade. But then I'll give you statistics. 81% of these armaments in the world are exported by 5 permanent members of the Security Council. Now, they may be highly responsible to their national government, but that doesn't work towards a global democracy. So we have to think about, and in that context, and quite often, and here again I would say, large, not just the NGOs, but a large number of activists have raised, and including people in the anti-globalization movement. So I would say, I agree with Joe that global democracy is one of the answers to the globalizing what, even though I interpret the question with a slightly different focus than he has done. Now, what about global equity? And here I will say I think that there is an enormous reason to think that to be one of the answers to the possible question, globalizing what? Equity being a possible answer to that question. Now, the equity issue is, in my judgment, often misstated on both sides. On one side, there is a rhetoric which you rightly criticize, saying the rich are getting richer, poor are getting poorer. If you say that, by the way, any gathering, humane people always agree with you. They don't treat it as an empirical statement. They treat it as an indication that you have a soul, that you have agreed. Now, that's not the way actually the things have. By and large, if you looked at the distribution of income in the world, it's arguable. As Professor Sudhir Anand, who is sitting there, he'll give you different measures depending on which one you use. It has gone up or gone down. It's a very complex question. But people tend to agree, namely they agree that they are worried about the equity issue. But then again, sometimes in the contrary argument says, the rich are not getting, well, rich are getting richer, but poor are not getting poorer. Sometimes they're getting a bit richer too. I think that's the wrong question to ask here. Now, it's been about 30 years that I've been talking about an obscure mathematician, and usually I could say that you have never heard of him, but he wrote a paper in Econometrica in 1950. His name was John Nash. And unfortunately, I'm not able to say that. My friend Sylvia Nasser had made that impossible, followed by some follow-ups. But that John Nash paper argued that the right way of thinking about it isn't whether from a cooperative thing both sides gain. That is true of hundreds of alternatives. The question is, among all the cases where both parties gain, is it a fair division of the gains? And what he does is to provide an axiomatic structure. I began by criticizing it, giving an alternative proof of his theorem, and criticizing the axiom, tried to give an alternative set of axioms. We've all been very engaged in it. It's a big contribution in social choice theory. And the question still remains, whether or not you accept the answer, the question is still exactly right. It's not adequate to say that the poor are not getting poorer, so why worry? I mean, if you live in a deeply unequal world, that's not just adequate. You have to ask, given the manifest inequality that we see and the inequity, are the poor getting a fair deal in the system? That's the question that we have to look at. And that requires a whole lot of institutional rethinking. The Bretton Woods Agreement set up the present institutional structure with a good deal of imagination at that time, but it focused very much on issues at that time. The World Bank was called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, as it would be called. Reconstruction of Germany and Japan and other countries, Europe and Asia, devastated by the war, was an important thing. The world has moved on. Half the world was in colonialism of Britain or France or Portugal. There wasn't a single poor country which was democratic at that time. Human rights as a possible thought was hardly emerged. It was basically thought to be some kind of a confusion on the part of not very hard-thinking lawyers. By the way, it's thought like that even today often, despite the quite an extensive literature on that. The world has changed from that. Now, to some extent, there's been recognition. There was a need for an institution that is dedicated to trade expansion, and WTO plays that role. I'm not opposed to WTO. I think WTO does quite a major job. I am opposed to WTO being also given the charge of looking after the environment. The idea that all these ministers, representatives of finance ministries would come and sit together and talk about the environment seems to me laughable. You need a different kind of representation there. I think the whole issue, the commitment to global equity, looking at it from a different perspective, I think requires a different type of organization. And whether it should be part of the United Nations and how the power within the United Nations could be divided, all these questions have to be addressed. But I would have thought that to think that global equity issues could be dissociated from that institutional question would be a mistake, and I think we have to think how we might proceed in that direction. Now, I would, in order to finish off, I must not take more time. Let me just end with the remark that it's not just global equity that we ought to be concerned with, but also global efficiency. I think the term efficiency, like many of the terms I'm discussing, has been one of the most misunderstood terms. Efficiency can be judged when you have identified what the objectives are. In that context, is it efficient in pursuing it? There's no such thing saying efficient. I say, if somebody said, I am just efficient, and you said, efficient in what? He said, no, I'm just am efficient. I don't think that communicates anything. It has to be something. Now, I think the demands of global efficiency have to be seen quite differently. Take a subject in which many of us are involved. And again, if I may put on my Oxfam hat, NGO, as an NGO thing, we have been very involved in Oxfam, is the issue of intellectual property rights and the effect that drug prices, it has on drug prices, on the pharmaceuticals and so on. How do we judge that in the light of efficiency? Now, there are two arguments that are given in defense of intellectual property rights. One argument is an entitlement argument of a kind that is done without the brilliance and sophistication of Robert Nozick's reasoning, but it's done as a kind of immediate argument that if I have created a knowledge, I own it. It's mine. And if you want to use it, you ought to pay me something. So that's the kind of entitlement argument. The other argument is, no, it's not that. It's just that unless you give me property right over the knowledge that I develop, I will not develop that knowledge. I need the incentive to do it. It's a very different kind of argument. The former has, first of all, nothing to do with efficiency. It's just saying that it just is mine. I have some difficulty in understanding what kind of a concept property right over knowledge is. Though there are times when I think that we in India should have patented the decimal system before we allowed it to go out. And the multiplication table elsewhere and so on. So I think there's a real difficulty as to what one might mean by it. So in any case, that is really orthogonal, really quite unconnected with efficiency. It doesn't do much for efficiency. So the argument, if there's a global efficiency argument in favor of existing intellectual property right, it must be that it's serving what? Our objectives better. But what are our objectives? Well, if you're dealing with drugs, presumably the objective is to develop the right kind of drugs and use them very extensively. Now, we are in this odd position that there may be drugs that are known which cannot be used, not because they're hard to produce and they cost much. It's just that by the time you've added royalty to it, it costs an enormous amount. well, that can't be a very efficient way of distributing that drug. It may not be very efficient even for the drug company to earn money, because if you don't sell any drug, you don't get any royalty either. It's half the time a dog in the manger, but it doesn't have the feature of being efficient even in that context, but not to mention the broader efficiency that a globalized ethics might demand. It certainly would be an argument from that point of view to change it, but people then say, what about developing drug? Will people have the incentive to do it? Now, are the incentives right at the moment? I mean, certainly, if you take, again, the AIDS thing, the kind of drug that would be most needed are, of course, single-use preventive vaccine of some kind. And if you look at the allocation of resources, that's not where the pharmaceuticals tend to put an enormous amount of money, and understandably, from their point of view, because, you know, you make a little bit of money the first time, but once you've vaccinated them, well, that's it. I know some people got cheered up when they looked at this smallpox was about to come back, and some kind of vaccine-based research might again flourish. But the fact is that I don't think the incentive structure works at all at this moment. It doesn't work very well for developing the right kind of drug. It doesn't work very well for using the drug that we already know. This is not to deny that incentives are extremely important. I'm absolutely dyed-in-the-wool economist. I do believe that incentives are extremely important in living in a world which is feasible, which works, and I'm a great believer in efficiency, but I'm a believer in efficiency with the objectives that are properly specified. And in that context, it seems to me that the demands of global equity, demands of global efficiency also require certain radical reform. But these may not be quite the form in which the anti-globalization, quote-unquote, protesters they pose their critique. But underlying their concern are issues, I believe, exactly of this kind, in which history figures, in which democracy figures, in which equity figures, and in which efficiency too figures. So I have to give a kind of diverse answer to that question. I'm in the great danger. I began with quoting Buddha saying some question can be asked of which there are no answers. I've now given several answers, but I will stop there because I hope that there will be some discussion at this point. Thank you.
Well, Amartya, as usual, you've given us a brilliant tour of many centuries, many topics, many disciplines, and I promise I will continue my donations to Oxfam. We have time for questions. There are 2 microphones here on the floor and 2 in the balconies, on the halfway up. Please make sure your questions are brief, not speeches, 1 speech per night. End them with a question mark. Keep them on the topic. Basically, it's a very broad topic, but on that. And please identify yourself and your relationship to the university so that it makes it more interesting for the speaker and the rest of us. And I might add 1 question per customer, because there are lots of people who want to ask. So let's start here.
Good evening. My name is Roshana Kamalai Tehrani. I'm a mid-career student at the Kennedy School. You mentioned that the question, that we shouldn't be asking the question that are both the poor and the rich getting better off, but that in the spectrum of available choices, is the best solution, the most equitable solution, the one that we're picking for the poor? And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, in your view, is it possible at the level of consumption and the way we live in developed countries, is the application of that solution, that best solution for the poor, at all possible? Or do we have to not only try to bring the poor, quote unquote, up, but bring us ourselves in the way we live down to find that equilibrium?
Well, it's a very interesting question. Let me say first that I wasn't arguing that it has to be necessarily best, but it has to be acceptable. which is not the same. Nash was looking for the best solution, certainly. But some of the ways in which many of us, including myself, criticize the solution is that it demands little too much, that you may have some incompleteness, you might not be able to say it's very best, but it just reached a level of acceptability such that we need not have sleepless nights about it. So the question, in your sense, to be modified would be not whether we can do the best. I'm sure we can't do the very best because that requires a level of knowledge, a level of our power over the world which we don't have. But can we make things more acceptable? I would say the answer is yes. I think, and let me put on, I mentioned I'm a dyed-in-the-wool economist, and let me put on an economist hat, and again a proposition which is not often recognized by non-economists adequately, and sometimes by economists either. And it's this, that if you take a market solution, there is no such thing as the market solution. What prices would emerge? What distribution of income? What distribution of goodies would emerge? Would depend on a number of conditions. It will depend on the initial distribution of resources, which of course, if you're dealing with things like human resources, of course have a great deal of movability in them. Every time you're setting up a school, you're changing the market outcome. It's not often recognized. Every act of setting up a primary school will have an impact in shifting the market equilibrium in somewhat different direction, because there are people getting more resources which they didn't have. Similarly, it is influenced by any market system operates within certain laws. Patent laws is something which I was discussing, and the market outcome will depend on those too. So in varieties of ways, even with a market economy, provided that the market is not the only institution, and that has been really my central concern, whether the other institutions are functioning properly. If they are functioning properly with an interest towards equity and efficiency, as I was trying to argue, I think we could make a dramatic difference without actually shooting yourself in the foot by getting rid of the market economy. That many countries have tried, and it's been total disaster. It doesn't work like that, often conditioned to famine too. At the same time, we can also know of a market economy which produces deeply unjust outcomes. So what I'm arguing for is, and from that point of view, your question is exactly the right one for me to address. The answer to me is emphatically yes. That is, it's within the realm of possibility to change the distribution of income. You had an addendum to which I'll come in a minute. And that requires not doing away with the market, but on one side guaranteeing that the market has enough competition, but at the same time doing a lot with other institutions, which includes regulations about patents and lots of other things. It requires thinking about educational policy, health policy. Every time you set up a hospital, you change the market outcome. It also requires thinking about what different countries owe to the world in terms of trying to help each other. There is a kind of comforting thought which people often have, which is related to your question. That's why your question is so good, saying we couldn't make a difference, really. That's just not true. We could make a dramatic difference. So, if there are two things that I like about the anti-globalization protesters, it's not their terminology. I don't think I'm going to learn English from them. But the two things I like are, one, they bring a global ethics to bear, and secondly, they bring a kind of optimism to bear that we could make a difference, we could change the world, which I don't think is unrealistic. It's not that, I know that people often think of, romantic optimists, but there are also romantic pessimists who believe that nothing could ever happen and nothing could change. Now, your addendum was, can this happen without the rich becoming poorer in some ways? I think that's a complex question. Every time you have a redistributive taxation, of course, the rich do get a bit poorer. The question is, in the context of things, would that be an adequate consideration that even the rich themselves would be very worried about, and if they are worried about, should society be worried about? I wouldn't have thought that that is enough of a deterrent in this case. I personally don't think that most of these changes will be such that it would impoverish people very much. I think it's still, and that's why I come back to the question again, it is really a question of gains being distributed differently rather than some people's losses being raised in terms of, with gains for others. So, excellent. Thank you for the question.
The right side.
We have to have spatial justice, you're saying.
Well, it's an honor to be able to ask you a question. I'm Karen Laming. I'm a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School. And I've worked for a long time trying to understand the role that agriculture plays as a form of livelihood and employment, especially for poor people in the developing world. And I'm curious, there's several proposals now in the Agreement on Agriculture. One, to put a development box in it that would put some food security measures in kind of the screen for the WTO and the Agreement on Agriculture itself. I also worked on a proposal for something like a global food security convention that would remove some of the aspects of agriculture from the WTO. And then there's kind of business as usual, agriculture as a commodity to be traded, or agricultural products or commodities to be traded on the world market. So of these options, which do you think, in your own assessment, I mean, this may be quick because you haven't thought about it, but maybe you have, would be best for the developing world when you're talking about the equity issues?
Well, I think it has to have features of all of those and some more. You know, you have already mentioned some of the things that people very much are talking about. Food prices, you see, there's an oddity about it. While Malthusians and neo-Malthusians keep on worrying about the coming food shortage, the fact is not only the world has continued to produce food at a faster rate than population growth, but that has happened at a time when food prices have fallen in the course of the last 30 years by about 70%. Not to about 70%, but by about 70%. They're about a third cheaper in comparison with other prices. Now that, I would have thought, by and large, is a cause for celebration, because food, cheaper food is good for the hungry. So one has to have a complex idea, and sometimes deranged ideas, which produces in my country now the peculiar combination of the largest food stock in the world, like 70 million tons of grains. If you laid the sacks next to each other, we wrote, Jean Drez and I, some years ago, that it will go to the moon and be almost back, and now I'm able to tell you, now go to the moon, come back, and go back again to the moon. And that combined with there being a great deal of hunger in the country. So I think that, and part of the reason is that the prices are artificially supported, partly because of the producers' lobby. And I'm deliberately taking this up because the argument, the anti-globalization argument, quote unquote, is often taken from the producer's angle. We have to bear in mind that a great many more people buy food than sell food in the world. And by and large, we have to celebrate the cheapening of food. But there is a question. Some people do sell other commodities, and you want to be able to give them, provide them with a livelihood which would allow them to buy food and other necessities of life. And so the question that you're raising is right, but it should not be taken the simple form of keep primary goods, including food prices, up. That's not the way to solve it. The other thing, way it has to be extended, and this has been, if there's some subject in which I now feel frustrated, having for 40 years argued, one of them, of course, is Indian elementary education. The other is African industrialization. When I first started writing 40 years ago, I was told that, it's really just not thinkable. In developing countries, there's a sequence. You do agriculture, you prosperous agriculture, then you do industry. And country after country busted that. East Asian countries did. South Asians, that was to a considerable extent doing it. Southeast Asians have already done. Africa is the exception. And always it's argued that can you imagine a prosperous industry in Africa? I can, absolutely. And you're never going to have industrial prosperity in Africa without actually developing an industrial base, because skill formation depends on experience, depends on transmission of a culture of a different kind. So that I think sometimes I'm quite worried about the anti-globalization argument in primary goods, because it seems to block off the most natural way for Africa to become richer, like the rest of the world has become richer. Every country in the world has become richer through industries. The biggest agricultural producers in the world today are primarily industrial countries. And I think we have to reformulate the question. So I would say I will accept the kind of line in which you are thinking, but I would add to it ways of keeping food prices low, which is in the interest of the world, and nevertheless make people survive. And for that, of course, the industrialization is extremely important. And there's a kind of peculiar argument, which there are two peculiar arguments. One is to say that, you know, food prices are so low and people are hungry, therefore people should concentrate on food, production of food. Now that's completely non-economic argument. And the other is to say, you know, Africa has a lot of famine because food price, you know, climate is so uncertain. And therefore we have to concentrate on agriculture. Well, if climate is uncertain, you ought to get out of agriculture and produce other goods, not completely get out, and earn it so that you are in a position to buy these commodities. So I think, I mean, the reason I feel very frustrated is that I don't see a prosperous future for Africa without industrialization, without going in the direction of modernity that industrialization brings with it. And of course it doesn't help to have a Cold War going on your borders all the time. Good news this morning about Angola being, you know, entering a situation where there might be industries. When my daughter was sent by Red Cross to Angola, and she managed to got herself catapulted into Hoyombo, and then immediately after the rebels bombed the airport, and we were out of contact for about a week or more. One of the things that I got in the report is that the description makes it quite clear why no one could think about, an insane mind, think about starting a factory in that situation. So that has to stop. So I think one has to think about a vision of the future of Africa, which is very different from the same old vision. And I see too much conservatism in some of the anti-globalization movement, which want to freeze Africa into a successful agricultural economy protected by higher food prices and higher agricultural prices. That's not my vision.
So would you
I'm
keep the
sorry,
development
one
box
per
out?
customer. The balcony, you have a lot of other people who'd like to ask questions. On the balcony? Right side?
Hi, my name is...
Where exactly are you?
It's hard to see, Marty, but under that very
Okay,
bright light.
all right, okay, I see you now.
Hi. My name is Noemi Gishpens. A couple years ago, I was a research associate for Joseph Stiglitz at the World Bank. That's my affiliation. And I have just a very narrow question. When you were talking about trade, you said that it was definitely a good thing and we should accept that and then move on and think about ways in which it would be good. And one way in which it might be good or not good is the question of having a certain measure of security from a certain amount of self-sufficiency. I'm thinking particularly of small countries with only one or a very few exports on the world market whose prices are regulated by the world market and may fluctuate quite a lot. And I'm wondering, for those countries, is totally free open trade a good idea, or should they first concentrate on self-sufficiency, make sure that they have what it takes to at least eat and maybe clothe and shelter their people, and then whatever's left over, they can then think about trading? That's my question.
Yeah, I think that that is a hard question to answer at that general level. It really depends on the country in question. There are some commodities which have a kind of stabilized market such that that is not a real danger, whereas other cases there is a problem. But there's also the question that relates to the question that the last questioner asked about to what extent you can protect people by getting out of the trade thing, by, in this case, by keeping trade out, by protecting those industries, and to what extent that actually generates a kind of psychology and a climate in which we will find kind of modern industrial progress or modern economic progress very difficult in the long run. All these issues come up. What would be the effect of protectionism? What are the benefits of protectionism? So I don't rule out the issue saying that there could well be cases where there is an argument for restricting trade. But to jump to that conclusion for a whole class of countries would be, I think, quite mistaken. I'm just saying that there could exist cases of that kind. I don't think Joe Stiglitz's position would be different from mine. I can't see you because of the light, so I don't know whether you're agreeing or not. but you know, there are a lot of people who, of course, write about these the subjects. I mean, I'm by no means an expert on this, and you probably know a great deal more than I am. But I would be very surprised if you could get a blanket yes or no to that class, that type of question.
Now the left balcony, which is again under those very bright lights.
Hello, my name is Alex Patterson. I'm a junior at the college and a social studies concentrator. The question I had for you, Professor, was whether or not you believe that there's a normative ideology that underlies the profession and the discipline of economics, and whether or not through globalization, if there is such a normative ideology, it might prejudice against forms of social organization that aren't based, and this is potentially through, this is in my understanding of what this normative ideology might be, on a conception of individuals as self-interested and as naturally possessing unlimited wants.
Well, you know, I think the short answer to your first question is no, I don't believe the economics profession is based on a normative ideology of any very specific kind. It's quite standard for a number of economists to make those two assumptions that you made, not so much the latter, unlimited one. Usually there are, I know that in the general equilibrium context there are little bits of non-saturation put in, a distinction between global non-saturation and local non-saturation and so forth. But by and large, I think that's not as serious an issue as the issue of assuming individuals to be self-interested in their action. That's very widely used in economics and in peripheral fields like law and economics also. The fact, however, is that that's by no means a universal assumption that economists standardly make, and nor is the history of the subject connected with it. And one of the oddities, of course, is that Adam Smith is often given that thought that the economic man and the person who looks only after his or her own interests and nothing else is the only kind of people exist in the world. That wasn't Smith's view, and that wasn't his economics either. In fact, he's even, I think I'm quoting Smith rightly, to say that there's even a passage where he says any government intervention, the trouble is that the government interventions are often in the interests of the rich. Any government intervention in the interests of the poor would be justifiable. In the interests of the rich would not be. Alas, it's mostly in the interests of the rich. Now, Adam Smith is a reasonable economist, I think, and so I don't really see that as a basic feature of economics. And you know, if you take the great economists of our times, I think you can see a lot of writings of whether you take Kenneth Arrow or Paul Samuelson or Bob Solow. I can think of other economists who don't take that view, but there's a variety of motivations that economists have played around with. So I don't really see a real tension there. I do see that it is quite important to recognize the multiplicity of motivations that we have, and we recognize that human beings have in our economic thinking. But that's not a threat to the subject. It's an invitation in some cases to extend their work a bit further.
left side of the floor.
Hi, my name is Zayed Yassin. I'm an undergraduate at the college, fourth year. When we talk about globalization and the spread of ideas, it seems like you might be able to break it down into ideas of democracy/human rights, truly open and free trade, and international finance capital. And oftentimes these things are either conglomerated and sold as one big package or broken out and put against each other. So I'd like to ask you, in your idea of globalization as we see it now, how tightly linked are these different ideas and the spread of those ideologies? And then how do we deal with hypocrisies within the ideology about democracy? The worldwide spread of democracy is, as the current president likes to say, democracy is our greatest export, and then democracy being for some and not for others, or the idea of free trade, but free trade for computers, not for steel or not for textiles. How to deal with those kinds of hypocrisies within a framework of a globalizing economy.
Well, I think those things that you listed, I would draw lines between them. You see, some of them are important in themselves, I think, as goals. And I think I tend to put human rights in that category. Properly defined human rights have that feature. Whereas international finance capital, or whatever it is that you put, I wouldn't have thought. I mean, if they have any merit, it's not because we thrill at the idea of international finance capital, even if you understand what that means. But it's just that the claim has to be that it's very good for people's welfare or their human rights or their freedom or some such thing. So the first thing would be to distinguish between those things which are valuable in themselves and with those things which are at most instrumentally valuable. Now, once one has done that, then of course one has to raise question about, say, financial arrangements in a way that human rights would not be. Now, human rights may clash with each other, and you have to face that issue, and that's the kind of question any kind of ethical debate does involve. But it does not at least begin by saying, why do we want human rights? Because after all, if human rights consists of freedom, which is important, and if you think it's important, I do, and perhaps lots of people do, and the other part of a right is a correlate of duty, what Kant would call imperfect obligation on the part of, in the case of human rights, of people generally to do something to promote it. If you regard these to be rather important, to live in a society where people's freedom are important and where others recognize that freedoms are important, which is what the correlate duty in this case would be, then you've got a kind of justification which makes it stand in a completely different way from the others. Now, it may often turn out that international finance would be fine and dandy for that, would serve it extremely well. It may turn out that it may not. In the case of East Asian crisis, no one wrote on that as much as Joe Stiglitz, who was being quoted earlier. The claim was, I'm not discussing whether the claim is correct or not, the claim was that the kind of financial arrangement that existed or that was being imposed by the fund, IMF, it actually was very counterproductive. If that argument is correct, then one would say, well, that undermines finance because that's not an intrinsic value. So if you split them up into those things that we can value for their own sake and those things which are instrumentally valuable, for the latter we have to ask the question, what is it doing for us and what is it doing for those things which we intrinsically value? That's the level at which I'll take the question rather than giving a straightforward answer that they are indivisible or divisible or I can't give that answer because I don't think that's the way you want to ask the question.
We'll have to make this the last question.
Thanks. First of all, thank you for a very elegant discussion of this topic. I'm Phil Caper from the faculty of the School of Public Health. I was interested in your comments about pharmaceuticals and agree with them, particularly the observation that the combination of intellectual property rights and how they're implemented and economic incentives seems to distort the availability of pharmaceuticals, not only in developing countries and poor countries, but also in a country such as this one. And I'm wondering where the availability seems to be driven more by the potential or perceived potential for profit than by any reasonable definition of need. How would you change the existing system to eliminate that?
I don't think you're going to eliminate it. You know, I think the fact is that this is your microphone. I mustn't. You mustn't. No. It's one thing to disagree, but to take your microphone.
Wheelchair.
I don't think the world I mean, when I said that I do take incentives very seriously, and I am a dyed-in-the-wool economist, I think people, you have to, I mean, the question was raised, is profit the only motive? I don't believe it is, not even for pharmaceutical companies. But profit will be among the major motives, and perhaps especially for pharmaceutical companies. And in that context, you have to ask the question, that's the world in which we live, how we can most efficiently pursue our objectives, which may be to have a good world, of which equity is a part. There's even such a thing as efficiently pursuing equity. And what kind of arrangements? Now, that is not one in which patents will be abolished. I don't think you can live in a world of that kind. It won't produce that result. But that's not the same thing as patent laws do not require major modification. I think quite a lot of the debate have, unfortunately, gone on with those who defend intellectual property rights believe that that's it. They're not going to allow any change. And the other side taking the view that, you know, it's completely evil. You change, remove it. As I mentioned, I don't believe having property over knowledge could be justified as an entitlement in any sense. Knowledge is not that kind of, it's not a commodity in that sense. And yet, I think the argument, the incentive argument for property rights could be quite strong, even on intellectual things, in order to give people incentive. One has to be imaginative on that. You know, one of the interesting, Michael Kramer here in the Department of Economics, he had been pursuing for a while this idea on the AIDS thing, knowing how gullible academics are about prizes and so on, that if you announced a prize that would give, that anyone who finds a vaccine for prevention of AIDS will get a prize which is 10 times the Nobel Prize. And that would be still relatively small amount of money. As a recipient, I can assure you that's the case. And it can generate a tremendous amount of incentive, actually encouraged by Michael. In fact, I had one opportunity. There was Bill Clinton had a discussion group had a panel, and I went to that. And I arrived late. I didn't go to the morning session, so I missed the lunch. And I went to a room, and I found my only occasion when I encountered Bill Gates, because he too arrived late. So I held in for 20 minutes waiting. So I popped a question saying, what about this prize, you see? And then he listened to it. And at some stage I said, how much money do you think eventually you might spend on that? And I think the number, I can't think, was, he said, oh, I don't know, in the long run, maybe 20 billion or something like that. It did seem many, many times the value of the prize, but I don't think I got a convert to Michael Kramer's proposal. It would have still been a major incentive. So I think the incentives also, and that's also one of the things, it's not only the finance, it's also the way people react, even prizes. I think the kind of mystique connected with the Nobel, for example, is not just finances. I can't help telling a story since Joe Stiglitz's name came up. The evening before the prize was announced, he was called up by local PBS office saying, we'd like to interview very early in the morning, Professor Stiglitz, and Joe, pretending not to know what it might be about, said, why so early? He said, oh, well, you see, it's really about the Nobel Prize that we want to interview you. And it will happen very early in the morning. It's announced at 5 o'clock our time here. And so Joe said, oh, yes. Where will it be? He was quite willing to be interviewed. And he said, well, there's some papers I'll pass on to you, said this gentleman from PBS. we believe that Herman de Soto is going to get the prize tomorrow. And we would like to hear your views on his, on his economics. And when the same person rang up Joe next morning, he had to ask the question whether he was still interested in interviewing Joe, despite the fact that de Soto has not got the prize. So I think there's a whole lot of ways in which we are gullible. We react to this, that, and other, including having a good reputation, which is one of the things that the pharmaceuticals do have. And I'm one of the competitive firms, for example, in the context of age medicine is an Indian one, namely Cipla, in which some members of my family have worked in the past. And I know that they're driven partly by money, and certainly they want to make money, but they partly also want the glory of being the one which busted the Western cartel. So in all kinds of ways, we have to take a broader view of incentives. But it's not something that you can do without incentives, nor one in which the financial incentive is ever going to go away. That's the world in which we live, and we have to build equity in that world.
Before I ask you to join me in thanking Amartya, I need to announce that there's another forum this evening, so everybody will have to leave this auditorium. The doors will reopen at 7:45 for the next forum. But Amartya, I want to say that you have demonstrated not only the reason why you have a Nobel Prize, but the reason why you'll be welcome back to lecture here anytime you want. So please join me in thanking Amartya Sen.
That was really superb. That was very nice. You may want to come off on this side here.